Walk here in Sydney. It's looking a bit like Barbados, but it hasn't been feeling like Barbados in recent days here in Sydney during this summer. We've had a lot of rain, so it's really good to have a walk with the sun out, and I'll use this opportunity to tell you about the direction the campaign for victims of Australia's deadliest medical scandal, contaminated blood, is taking. And my name is Charles Mackenzie. Well, if you've been following what we've been doing, you might know that I've been campaigning for the best part of 30 years. And over that 30 years, obviously I was a lot younger when I started. And one of the biggest elements, one of the big takeaways over the 30 years is the amount of times I've been told that it's impossible. It's impossible for Australia to have an investigation into its deadliest ever medical scandal. Now, the only kind of investigation that will do is a Royal Commission of Inquiry. And that's what the Australian government and the Australian Red Cross and the blood products giant CSL have been trying to stop ever since I've been campaigning. And so that's basically what's characterised the campaign, being told no. I've had some very high profile Australians that I've reached out to, and I've said to them, look, there was a global contaminated blood scandal before the 2000s. Canada had a legal investigation, it found massive wrongdoing. Ireland had a legal investigation, same thing, help offered to victims and their loved ones. And now the United Kingdom has its largest ever legal investigation, the Infected Blood Inquiry, which has found massive problems. I've been a witness of that. And yet these high profile Australians just say, no, it can't happen in Australia. It won't happen here. We can't have our own investigation into our nation's deadliest medical scandal. And the media here in Australia have not been very supportive in recent times, it has to be said. We can't get any of the main TV stations, even our public broadcaster, which we pay for, the ABC, they have refused contaminated blood victims' pleas for decades that the scandal be investigated. Four Corners, not interested. I remember an executive producer of Four Corners, I think it was 20 years ago, Michael Doyle, had a conversation with him, and he asked me just how many Australians had been impacted by this. And I said, tens of thousands. And the phone went dead. Pretty much that was it. The link just went dead. I would have thought that any journalist or producer of an investigative program, when they're told that tens of thousands of Australians had been hit with things like HIV and Hep C as a result of contaminated blood transfusions, people who've, parents have buried children, families have seen their fathers or their mothers gone and been left as orphans and poverty, I would have thought that would have automatically been something that a taxpayer-funded broadcaster would look at. Four Corners and its program's 7:30 report have looked at all sorts of issues. Then you've got the Show Australian story. They'll tell you about how, Australia's running out of people that properly tune pianos. It's an important issue, isn't it? But they won't tell you about how thousands of Australians have got Hep C and have been left with things like liver cancer and cirrhosis as a result of contaminated blood that was given not always in life-threatening situations. No, a lot of these patients were people with the bleeding disorder haemophilia who, this was a treatment, they weren't going to die without the blood. Then there were others who were having elective surgery, who would have put the surgery off and taking the blood off had they been told what authorities knew. And authorities knew that Australia's blood supply was contaminated for decades, ever since inception. Pretty much since the blood banks began operating in Australia, our blood supply has been contaminated by things like hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and in fact hepatitis C contaminated Australia's blood supply right up until the late 90s. Yes, it did. But the worst periods were before 1990, and of course in the 1980s you had the emergence of HIV. And in fact I went to school with a young kid who caught HIV from a blood product. And this was a blood product given to him for some bruising, for goodness sake, as part of a treatment for his haemophilia. And he ended up dying of AIDS. And ever since then, I've been trying to get answers as to what the bloody hell went wrong with that kid's treatment. He didn't even need that to survive. Necessarily anyway, it was a treatment for his haemophilia and it cost him his life. And there's been no answers and no support for people who've been caught up in this terrible, terrible scenario of contaminated blood. So, for 30 years I've been told no. I've gone to politicians. I remember the Tasmanian Independent Senator Brian Harradine. He supported us. He's deceased now, unfortunately. He was a noble guy, a very honest guy, and a very humble guy. He called for a Royal Commission. Well, my mate, the late great Labor Senator Stephen Hutchins, he helped us get us a Senate committee that looked into this before he was corruptly ousted as the chair. That's when the government and a bunch of corrupt politicians worked out that Senator Hutchins was getting close to working out that Australia's deadliest medical scandal was not quite the accident. When authorities do rarely ever speak about this issue, when pressed on it, they'll tell you that it was a tragedy, part of the wider tragedy of HIV, AIDS and so on. But they won't tell you about how they knowingly collected blood from contaminated donors. Did you know that? They used to send out letters to people who donated blood. This is in 1990. And if you were tested to be positive for hepatitis C, they'd ask you to come back and donate your blood. And they'd give it to haemophiliacs. Yeah, that's what they did. And 1,400 haemophiliacs have been killed in Australia by tainted blood, by HIV and hepatitis C tainted blood. And no one overseas did crazy things like that. Not as crazy as here. I mean, Australia was even, during the HIV crisis, advertising for blood donors in sexually explicit publications. No one in the world did that. No one in their right mind would do that during the HIV scare of the 1980s. But it happened here in Australia. And HIV tainted the blood supply and rose through the blood supply faster in places like Sydney and Melbourne than it did in other first world cities. How much of that had to do with them advertising for blood donors in sexually explicit publications during the HIV scare? Now, you can actually look on our YouTube channel. I've done videos on that, and I've actually shown the evidence of the publications. You can actually go also to infectedbloodaustralia.com and go to the section called The Evidence They Didn't Want You to See. You'll actually see also a timeline. It can sometimes take a minute or so for that timeline to open because of a third-party app that's a bit slow. But when you get to that timeline, have a look and go through all of the history of the blood banks and their use of certain blood donors, such as I say, their deliberate and knowing use of infectious blood donors. No one else in the world did anything as crazy like that, and yet inquiries into contaminated blood scandals overseas have found massive wrongdoing. So you can only imagine what would be found if there was an inquiry here, a Royal Commission here. And that's why the government have been fighting me for 30 years. Everybody just says no. I've had people tell me I'm crazy. I've even had the Australian Red Cross, humanitarians, try and jail me. Can you believe that? A humanitarian agency 20 years ago tried to have me jailed for revealing their knowing use of infected blood donors. Well, isn't that outrageous? It's like the crooks playing judge. How on earth was that able to happen? Well, I'm very glad I stood up to them and they were defeated. They didn't get their way. They also fabricated a bunch of nonsense to try and have me, prosecuted on. I haven't forgotten that. And that's why I'm still here. One of the many reasons also for the fact that I've lost many friends from our group. So, when young children lose their lives, and when parents bury children, I don't stop. I'm never going to stop investigating and demanding that we have answers and demanding that Australia has justice. We've got people in this country who are very readily tell me, you'll never get an inquiry, there'll never be a Royal Commission. I've even had Labor politicians when I've said to them, but there's been Royal Commissions or their equivalent in all these overseas countries into their respective blood scandals, and they've found massive wrongdoing. And they've turned around and said, oh, that's overseas, but that's in Europe, but that's in England. Almost saying, well, that can't happen here because this is Australia and we don't have things like that here. Really? We've always had justice here, thank you very much. We've always wanted it. Why would Australians want justice any less than any other group? And why the bloody hell do we have politicians that take such an attitude? What the hell has happened to our country? Really and truly. And I've heard enough. I've heard enough no's to last me for another 5 lifetimes. I spent 30 years being told no, No, we can't have an investigation into thousands of people becoming infected with things like Hep C or HIV from contaminated blood, much of it given in things like childbirth, or given for elective surgery patients, or children at my school like the lad with haemophilia who died from AIDS, or famous author Bryce Courtney losing his son Damon, who is the subject of his book April Fool's Day, about how he lost his son to an HIV contaminated blood product. Or then there's the actor Carla Bonner and friend to the Infected Blood Australia campaign. She lost her father to an HIV contaminated blood transfusion. She can't have answers. She'd get answers if she was English, if she was Canadian, but she's a star in Australia, and you know what? Doesn't matter. She can't have answers. Why? Because she's Australian. That's the difference. That's the only difference, and that's what we're standing up against. There's been a rise of this. There's been a willingness of the people who serve us, the people that we pay, the people that we elect to serve us. And there's been a willingness for them to turn the tables on us and just say, no, we're not going to do what you elected us for. We're not going to protect you. We're not going to support you when you want investigations into how parents lost children or how children lost their parents. No. We're not going to give any investigation. We're not going to provide any answers. We're not going to provide any assistance. And we pay people like this. Well, I've heard from them, and our group's heard from them for decades. And what we've heard is the same old, same old. They're not going to do a thing. And you know why that is? Because they're engaging in cover-up. They'd be wanting investigation answers if it was them or their children. But when it's Australia, they don't care. And yet they serve us. So now it's time for them to hear from us what we've got to say. And at Infected Blood Australia, this is what we've got to say. We've tried, we've asked nicely for years, we've watched our friends die, their deaths being hastened by a lack of help. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to ask those people that said no to appear in the legal investigation that we're going to force through the courts. The politicians said no. Well, we're going to ask the courts to say yes. How reasonable is it of the Australian government to deny an investigation into Australians who've been impacted by our nation's deadliest medical scandal? It's not reasonable, given the legal investigations that have happened overseas, and given the massive wrongdoing that's been established overseas, and given the fact that even they didn't do the crazy things that we did here. It's completely unreasonable. We're going to force a Royal Commission of Inquiry into Australia's contaminated blood scandal, and we're going to get answers for people who lost family members. It's just as simple as that. And I thank you if you've been following us, Infected Blood Australia. You are following us. I thank you so much. This is the place to keep watching, because there's a sense in Australia that, you know, authorities are willing, very willing, as I say, to heap injustice on us. Well, if you're a fan of justice and the spirit of justice, then I think you're going to enjoy what's going to come in the time ahead from us. Because yes, we're not taking no for an answer. We've heard no from them, and now we're going to go and see if we can get a yes from the courts, whether they'll back Australians who want to get answers as to how our blood supply could kill and harm as many people as it has done. Thank you very much for your time today. And remember, if you could support our call for a Royal Commission by clicking on the link in our bio, or clicking the link below in the description of this video. Thank you very much.